Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome. This is something I've looked forward to. We haven't done a large forum about hormones before, so this is the first time. You all are the beta, alpha, beta test group. So the title of this talk is "What You Don't Know About Female Hormones Can Kill You," which is in very scary print text, as you can tell. So that is actually a very true statement, and we want to try to unpack some of the story about hormones. We want to cover truths. We want to cover half truths. I don't want to be overly aggressive. I could say, there's a book about lies and then damn lies. I'm not sure we want to go that far. We're going to stick with truths and confusions and half truths just to be nice. I've been doing bioidentical hormones, natural hormone, as a focus and special thing for over 20 years. So the words and the things you've been hearing in the media would suggest this is fairly new, and for most people it is new. For me, however, it's rather old, and I think it's worth saying why it's kind of old. The reason why it's kind of old is because about 20 years ago there was a drug company from the Netherlands who made the first commercially available at a pharmacy, at regular pharmacies, natural progesterone, bioidentical natural progesterone that you could get at Walgreens and Rite Aid. And because they came out with this new drug, and it was patented because it wasn't patented because it was natural, and you can't patent natural things, but it had a patented delivery system where they had it in peanut oil or something like that, and it was special in terms of its delivery system. You can patent that. So they wanted everybody to know about it, so they did something that was revolutionary. At least to me it was, and to most OB-GYNs in America, what they did was, in order to promote their product, they got me and about 4 or 5 other doctors in California to go down to San Francisco for a few days, and they gave us all this information about why natural progesterone was so incredibly different from the progesterones we had been using for the past 20 years, and had been told that the ones we've been using, we've been told they were just wonderful and fine and dandy and great. And what they did was they showed us all this research which showed that they were not fine and dandy and great, and they were actually quite dangerous. And this was all 20 years ago. This was many years before the Women's Health Initiative study. And so the Women's Health Initiative study, I like to tell people, was a pretty good study. It really revealed conclusively and with more evidence a lot of things that we already knew, but it wasn't really a lot of new information unless you had not been paying attention. As it turns out, a lot of people had not been paying attention. So that's what happened. So what happened then, as a result of that visit, is that I was recruited to educate the entire central portion of California. So I went up and down from Sacramento to Bakersfield to San Luis Obispo, and just everywhere, just telling people about natural progesterone. And most of the doctors, let me tell you, they almost ran me out of the room after politely having a real nice steak dinner, and because these drug companies, they do that, steak and lobster or whatever, and then they ran me out of the room. They ate first and then they ran me out. Okay, because their whole thing was, look, I went through an entire medical school residency program by very honorable and high regarded doctors from UCSF and UC Irvine and UCLA, and now you're telling me that essentially all this stuff that I learned was basically wrong. And then they ran me out of the room. And so that's why I have Dr. Semmelweis's picture up here. Now I got to tell you about Dr. Semmelweis, and I'll try to be brief. Dr. Semmelweis was a Hungarian, I believe, European surgeon obstetrician in the 1800s, and he worked especially in obstetrics. They had an incredible mortality rate back then. When they got infections frequently, 10 to 30% of these women died, because they got infections frequently, and there was nothing really to treat them with. And so Dr. Semmelweis was was a real innovative thinker, and he didn't really know why this was so bad, but he had this idea. This idea was he came up with this idea to do hand washing before surgery and deliveries with a chlorine and lime solution to help sterilize the hands. Prior to that, nobody washed their hands for much of anything. I mean, this is 1840 and stuff like that, 1820s. And so he did this. The mortality rate in the hospitals where he was working for all those who followed this protocol diminished from 10 to 30% to less than 1%. His reward for that was that the doctors in the area were so outraged that he would upset the norms so dramatically that he was stripped of his license, run out of town. He was castigated in every way, made to feel like a non-human, and about 15 years later he died in an insane asylum just from being ostracized, persecuted, and beaten up. So I say all that to say this. Medicine does not always reward new thought and change gracefully, okay? And so, because at some point in this talk, I would have to tell you that you can listen to everything I say. I don't want to make this talk overly academic, so I'm going to take a lot of the medical references and research articles and just put them on my website. So you can look at them. More importantly, if you want to take them to your doctors or anybody else to say, well, not only did Dr. Fobbs tell me about this, but he gave me about 100 different research articles as a reference. Because here's what will happen. You have wonderful, loving, caring primary care doctors, many of whom I know and are good friends of mine. But they are not taught this information by anybody who they can rest assured on or with. Because the people they have to get their information from, since they didn't learn this in residency, would be when they go to their weekend courses in LA or in San Francisco by one of the medical schools, they're going to have a menopausal update. And they're supposed to tell them, but they won't tell them because this whole thing is a natural hormone thing, and we don't teach natural stuff in medical school. It's just not done. Patented medicine is what we teach, and anything else gets relegated to, well, it may exist, but we can't talk about it. That's just the way it is. They will sometimes say, just no, it's not good. We don't have any evidence of it. I wouldn't recommend you do it. That's probably what they would say. And what they mean by saying they don't have any evidence is that they haven't looked at any of the hundreds of articles that are available in research papers that show the evidence is true and real and important. And they don't have to, because most of those articles are European. Because we haven't used natural hormones in America, we really don't have much information. Fortunately, people in Denmark and France and England and places like that, where I have actually gone personally and verified they are actually real humans there who are much like we are, which means that the data is probably reliable when they do the research data. And also, they have some other advantages that we don't have. They have national healthcare systems, so when they start these studies, they can follow these people not for 5 or 6 years like we did in the Women's Health Initiative study. They can follow them for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, because they are in the system from birth till death. And they know exactly what they're taking. They know exactly how they get sick and what they get sick for. They know what they die from. They have great information. So I think it's great data. So that's how this starts. Next slide. Okay, so I already alluded to this a little bit, but this was to help allude to it even better. My wife picked this picture, by the way, and because I asked her to get the 800-pound gorilla in the room to make this point. So what does she do? She goes to the outback somewhere in Uganda and gets like a 1,600-pound gorilla, because so that's a real big gorilla in the room. The WHI is big. I'm not sure it's that big. The Women's Health Initiative study is a study, began back in the mid-1990s, and we started getting reports back around 2002, 2003. And that's when all the, like this old saying, that's when, and then the fight started. Because it, people reacted to it strangely and wildly and crazily, and I'm going to tell you why. It was a pretty good study. Because they used Permanent Provera, which I would have argued, well, And the people in Europe would have argued, well, why didn't, you're going to put together this, you know, billion-dollar study. Why not use some other hormones other than Permanent Provera? But they use Permanent Provera, which you could make a good argument for, because that's what people have been using for 50 years. So that did make some sense when you get right down to it. So they used Permanent Provera. And interestingly enough, it showed what we already knew. The group of people who they gave it to were not the best group of people. They averaged about 62, 63 years old. Ideally, if you're going to start a brand new, great, wonderful study on menopausal hormones, you kind of want to start around 50. If you look back at the French E3N study, which I'm going to talk more about, they start around 52, 53, which is where you'd want to start. Well, there were a lot of old women. I can't say older because of I know some of y'all too well. I'm not. So let's just say they started with quite a few women over 50. Let's just put it that way, even and over 60. And so at that age, you're going to have some pre-existing disease. You're going to have pre-existing everything. The older you get, more pre-existing stuff. So what happened then was that they got some outcomes that were exaggerated, and they just didn't understand why, so they panicked. In the first few years, they noticed a slight, and it was very slight. It was actually not considered statistically significant increased risk in breast cancer for those women who were using Permanent Provera. And of course, that's kind of hard to actually let come out of my mouth. We consider every breast cancer to be significant. So understand the key word was statistically significant, because we were very sensitive to breast cancer. Everybody is, but really not very much increase. And then they panicked and they spread this news all over the world and shut down the study. And you all know about that because that's what you heard about. What you didn't hear about was that the women who were just taking estrogen alone, and this was a bad estrogen to me, it was Premarin, a horse estrogen that has about 15, 20 different breakdown urinary products of a pregnant horse. And I watched y'all coming in the room. Nobody coming in the room looked anything like a pregnant horse. So that means that nobody in the room should be taking that, actually. So that's what they were taking. Notwithstanding that, the women who were using only Premarin, not Premarin and Provera, they had a 30% decreased risk in breast cancer in the first wave of reporting. They didn't tell anybody. Whereas the ones who were using Permanent Provera had about a 30% relative increase. And relative is real flaky. I don't want to get into statistics, but let me tell you something about relativity. If you have one woman in a million who gets breast cancer, and you give somebody a popsicle, and on the next assessment, they have 2 women in a million, then you have a 100% increased risk of breast cancer from that popsicle. So you really have to look at bigger numbers, the big significance, and they didn't do that. They used just a relative thing, had very small numbers, and then a very small increase, not statistically significant, but they made you all and most all the women in the whole world think that estrogen caused breast cancer. Now, what they didn't tell you specifically was that if there was something that really contributed to breast cancer, it was the artificial progesterone. Because we know progesterone is just one great, wonderful thing. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But synthetic progesterone is bad. It has direct toxic effects on the breast cells. It takes away most of the benefits of estrogen, and the estrogen benefits are great. Go to the next one. Let me see if I want to segue into that, Pam. Okay, yeah, we'll just segue into the next slide because we're talking more about natural versus unnatural. We talked about having one more slide, but we didn't do it. But imagine that there's just a nice one of you all standing up here, and we're going to look at a couple of important things, starting from the top. Let's just talk about the things that have to do with what I was saying about Premarin, but mostly Provera, that synthetic progesterone. You have a brain starting at the top, inside the skull, okay? We know from a large number of studies, very large, that estrogen has all kinds of astonishing protections and effects on the brain. So it's not just a menopausal hot flash, night sweat, mood swing, sleep thing, which it is. Great to have estrogen for that. and we know it works well for that. But it's important to look at the brain cells because it also diminishes your risk of dementia and Alzheimer's by a large number of investigative reports and studies, by about 50, maybe as much as 60%. Now, the reason I mention this now and at this place is because if you add a synthetic progesterone, or progestin like Provera or any other, that goes away. That goes away. So instead of having a protection against Alzheimer's and brain damage and death and so forth, it actually makes it worse. So when they did the Women's Health Initiative study, they looked at those women who were taking permanent Provera and said it didn't help dementia or Alzheimer's. It made it worse. Well, guess what? If you know anything about synthetic progesterone, which apparently they didn't know much, they were shocked and surprised. But if you looked at any of the data about synthetic progesterone that goes back far before the Women's Health Initiative study, you would have expected that. You go back to a wonderful study. This might insult some people in the room, but it was one done by a guy named Clarkson about 10 years before the WHI, and he did it on cytomologous monkeys. Now, I don't want to insult anybody, but if you look at the DNA of cytomologous monkeys and your DNA, they're not that much different. So when you do a study on them, you can get some real good data. I would say a lot better than these folks are doing a whole lot of mouse and rat data, okay? Because as you know, a lot of medical investigation is done using mice and rats, and I have a hard time getting my arms around that sometimes, but it's always been the case, and we do get some data. But then some guys at Harvard a couple of years ago figured out something revolutionary. They did a bunch of studies on mice and rats and humans, and they actually came to the conclusion that, mice and rats are not exactly the same as humans. They figured that out about 2 years ago, and because they had a bunch of studies that were based on mice and rats and infectious studies and stuff like that, and they figured it, and they looked at this close and they figured that out. They're not the same. But I'm not saying that the cytomologous monkeys are the same, but they're similar. So they were able to do something with the monkeys that we can't do with you guys. They were able to give them these tragically high-fat, bad-fat diets to see what happened to their blood vessels in their heart and in their brain. And what they found out is you gave them this terrible diet and put them on estrogen, it competed and fought and blocked them developing atherosclerosis, and it kept their arteries open at a remarkable rate compared to people who weren't getting estrogen, compared to the ones that they had taken out their ovaries. But if you added Provera, it accelerated atherosclerosis, and it made it much worse. And so this was known many, many years before the WHI. So why people were so shocked that when you add this synthetic progesterone, folks got bad and got worse, I will never understand. So the bottom line is we haven't figured out enough to replace natural hormones with synthetic hormones. We just don't know enough. People are still trying to do it because, you make a lot more money on a patented synthetic. Okay, so I'll give you an example of how that plays out. I was reading an article that a wonderful neuroscientist wrote about the same brain thing very recently. And he must have listed about 20 different ways that estrogen protects the brain. I mean, it was just an elegant article. And then at the end of the article, he says, but since we can't give women estrogen because, we're worried about giving them breast cancer, we got to come up with a synthetic that protects the brain like estrogen that we can give them. Okay, and of course you can say that because they don't understand natural estrogen. They only understand the story that has come out of the recent history of giving people unnatural estrogen and unnatural progesterone, are these Franken hormones. And that's a shame. So what do we do? So, I started to give a disclaimer at the beginning of the talk, and I said one of the reasons why I'm giving this talk is because we do bioidentical hormones. We actually love to do that. We promote that. We support that. And for what we can't do, we bless other people to do it, whatever. We just want bioidentical hormones everywhere we can get it. And so that's why we're here. and we want to get rid of the Franken hormone approach to hormones. We're missing so many wonderful things by limiting natural hormones. One of those things we're missing is estriol, which is a second estrogen, and it's so wonderful because we've gone around trying to come up with hormones that block the adverse effect of the strong estrogen, estradiol. And in fact, estradiol is strong, and it does have stimulatory effects on the breast. Let me tell you about that. All stimulatory effects on the breast are not bad. I mean, it's the stimulatory, effects that make the breast full and ready for pregnancy and attractive and up instead of down. There's all kinds of good things about, having a good strong estrogen to do that. But in nature, and here's the key, in nature, you also have estriol, which is weak estrogen. And that weak estrogen is very tenacious about attaching to breast receptors. And it doesn't allow the stronger estrogen to overstimulate. And then you have progesterone that also attaches to the breast receptors. And it doesn't let the estradiol overstimulate. And then you even have testosterone, which also competes and downregulates the proliferative or that growth aspect of the breast cell that keeps everything in check. So as we doctors, research doctors, go around trying to find excuses to not give people natural hormones, or they're really coming up trying to find out ways to give women artificial, synthetic hormones. As they're doing all that, we're missing out on this astonishing opportunity to give women stuff that really works, is really healthy, that really protects them. And let me tell you how that plays out. If you look at one of the groups of studies I like to refer to is a group of studies, because it's about 8 or 9, and they put them all together. And they're studies of women who've had breast cancer. And to make a long story short, they're very consistent. You would think, just like most people think today, especially all oncologists, you can't give women who've had breast cancer estrogen, right? Right, I mean, that's just the general thinking. I'm surprised I'm not in jail already, because we do give women who've had breast cancer estrogen, but we give mostly women who've had breast cancer estriol. Why do we do that? Because it helps, because we test the hormones of women who've had breast cancer, along with women who haven't had breast cancer. And what you find out is that they almost always have more estrogen, estradiol, the strong one, than you think. And so usually they don't need estrogen, estradiol. They need progesterone and estriol, maybe testosterone, to have a balance. And that balance really acts like a natural estrogen receptor modulator, which is what the scientists are always trying to figure out how to make, except all the modulators they make up in the laboratory, since they're unknown to man and God, they have a good effect and they have 5 or 10 bad effects. Like those commercials you see on TV every night where they have people dancing through the tulips and it does this wonderful thing, and then after that it gives you about 24 side effects, including premature death and lameness, blindness, but still they're dancing through the tulips before they get all that. So it's kind of like that. So the cool thing is that when it comes to natural hormones, you don't have any of those side effects. One of the things that it's in addition to the Women's Health Initiative showing that women taking estrogen by itself, even though it was a bad estrogen, still had a 30% decrease risk of breast cancer at about 6 years, and then 4 years later when they did the next analysis, still had 30% decreased risk. Amongst that group of women I was telling you about before I got sidetracked by the people dancing through the tulips, in those 8 or 9 studies, and it's about 8 or 9, maybe 10 when you put them all together, of women who were given hormones after breast cancer, there was one consistent thing. They had about a 30 to 50% reduction in recurrences of breast cancer, and they had about a 50% decrease in death or mortality 5, 10 years down the line. They also tend to just live longer and better and more reliably when you look at them long term, 10, 15, 20 years later. And you wonder, well, how is that? Some people just can't understand how in the world could you give somebody hormones, estrogen, and they have less breast cancer. I'm not saying we can explain it all. Now, if you give them bioidentical hormones, you can explain it. But honestly, a lot of those women were taking permanent Provera. so it's kind of hard to explain how people even did better on permanent Provera. I think it's because women are so astonishingly well designed that you can even give them the wrong thing and they'll do the right thing with it. Oftentimes, that's what I think. But that's not very scientific. They might do me like they do Semmelweis. Okay. Let me bring out. You all may not be able to read this, but I'm gonna point it out to you and tell you what it is. So if you can't see it, you'll know. This is a 70-year-old lady, and this is really important because most 70-year-old ladies are not having hot flashes and night sweats. And quite frankly, if they were asking somebody, well, why should I do hormones? They would say, are you crazy? Why are you talking about hormones? The problem is if they come to my office, they might get their hormones checked because we'll check anybody. Because we really, what we have realized is that hormones are surprising. They are not what you think. They need to be known. Ignorance is not bliss, okay? This is not by any means a worst case scenario. I didn't even want to show the worst case scenarios because they look so alarmist that somebody would have said, well, you must have gone through 100 or 200 different things to get that one. And they would have been right. So I'm not showing you a real bad one. This is a 70-year-old lady who came in on nothing, and she's got normal testosterone. That's good. She's got what they call depressed estrone, which is great because estrone is one of those undesirable estrogens. It's the one that actually is kind of toxic to the breast. So great. But her estradiol, which is a strong one, good one but strong, is 3. Now, what is 3? I tell you what 3 is. 3 would be perfectly fine for an 18-year-old. It'd be perfectly fine for a 25-year-old. It's a perfectly normal estrogen. Not high, but just perfectly normal. But she's 70 and on nothing. Now, here's the problem down here. Her estriol that I told you about that helps balance and make the stronger one safe, this is depressed. Now, when this one's depressed, fine. That's a bad estrogen. This is one that's very important for life and so forth. Give you a quick update on why that's so important. When women are pregnant, back in the old days before we had fetal heart rate monitoring and stuff like that, the way we knew that they were doing well was we tested their estriol because the placenta makes tons of it. And if it was high, we knew they were probably doing okay. So estriol is really important, and it's very and there are also studies that show that women who have high estriol, guess what? Not surprising, they have low breast cancer. So she's low in estriol, and she's almost bottomed out when it comes to progesterone. When you have estradiol of 3, just to give you all a kind of, in case any of y'all decide to be a GYN and start managing hormones, if you have an estradiol 4 or 5, then you want to have progesterone 2, 3, 400, okay, almost 100 times as high. So when you have a 33 with the 3, then that's 10 times too low, okay? So that's the problem there, and that gives you a natural estrogen dominance, estrogen excess, which we've always known makes you more likely to get breast cancer. And if you have a uterus, it makes you more likely to get uterine cancer. So this is not desirable. And we can do this with nice, cheap, and easily available natural hormones. Let's go to the next one. Okay, this one's different. This is a 47-year-old. And she's actually just around menopause. But she's special because she's had breast cancer. And she's not taking anything. She's just hitting menopause. She's got a 6 is her number of estradiol, twice what the other lady had. And her progesterone is 19. She's almost half what the other patient had, who was 70. And her estriol is 5, also bottomed out. So here's someone who's already had breast cancer. She's a few years out breast cancer. And because our teaching of what to do about women and breast cancer and hormones now is to do nothing except give them synthetic hormone blocking drugs that we don't quite know if they work, and I'll have at least a half a dozen to a dozen side effects. Other than that, we do nothing. We have no idea what's going on with their hormones. We tell them estrogen is bad, but we don't know whether the estrogen is high, low, medium, or what. And we have no idea what their estradiol or their progesterone or any of these other things are doing. So here's somebody with a robust, there's nothing wrong with her having a 6, by the way, even though we'd rather it be 3 or 4 or lower. We'd rather it be low normal, not medium to high. But the bottom line is, as long as these are up, this is okay. The problem is estradiol, estradiol and progesterone are down. So what we do when somebody says, well, Dr. Phelps, how can you treat this woman who's had breast cancer with hormones? Well, we're not giving her estrogen. Would if she really needed it. Some people come in with an estrogen level too low to measure, like 1 or 2 or too low to measure. We would give that person a little estrogen because they still have a lot of things to protect and to do, and we know it doesn't increase their risk of breast cancer. It makes them do better. But mostly we would focus on making sure they have enough estradiol and progesterone. So, those are the key things that we look at, and those are the key things that we do. I was going to kind of walk through the human female body and just go through a number of things, but very quickly, I would say that going, top to bottom, we talked about the brain. If we go to the neck, look at the carotid arteries. That's where you usually have atherosclerotic blocks and plaques and breaking off and strokes and stuff like that. It reduces that risk by 40, 50%. It reduces stroke risk by 40, 50%. When the hormones are natural, biological. And that was supported in the French study, also in the Denmark cardiovascular study. WHI simply showed that if people synthetics, they get more of all that, they do bad. So the Women's Health Initiative was very instructive. It told us exactly what not to do. So that's the way we need to look at it. It's not like it wasn't a good study. It was a great study in terms of teaching the world what to not do. But the problem was the response to that study was, well, we don't have a clue about what we should do, so maybe you should do nothing. And that's the travesty of this, is that our response to understanding and then utilizing and applying that study was very, very bad. So we just walk down the human body. If you get to the breast, bioidentical estrogen hormones actually protect the breast. And can reduce the risk of breast cancer. In the French study, it was a 10% reduction, but in many studies, if you look at them cumulatively, it can be 20 or 30%. We're hoping to have more than that amongst our patients. Now, I'm not saying that our patients can't get breast cancer, because they can. We're talking about reductions of 10%, 20%, 30%. We wish it would maybe 40%, but people can still get breast cancer. But women on hormones who took hormones before breast cancer or even after, they do better. So I tell people all the time, there's no downside to taking hormones. You have a reduced risk of taking hormones correctly, of course. You have a reduced risk of breast cancer, and if you are unlucky enough to get it, you have an increased probability by a great degree of surviving it, doing well, living a long and happy life. So it's a win-win situation, except for getting the breast cancer, which is not a win. But all these things we do to support you are helpful. Okay. So, this is a nice little blip by Tony Robbins. In your moment of decision, your destiny is shaped. And that's so important, because we're in a time now where I don't care what I say. You will go out and you will still get inundated by lots of negative stuff about hormones. If you ask the people giving you that negative information, what have you studied? What have you read? What have you done to know and understand for sure what you think and what your position is? You won't get very deep answers. I'll tell you, I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of research articles, because this is my passion. And once you get started, you almost can't get off the bandwagon, because it's so amazing the things that you see that are so different from what people are being told, and you go around pulling your hair out or trying to figure out, how do you reverse it, how do you fix it, how do you make it go away, and you can't, because the media, the conventional medical community is against it. And just like when I tell you about Dr. Semmelweis, when they're against something and they're entrenched, it does not change quickly. It will change, but it's going to take a long time. I asked a good friend of mine recently, and he said, my guess, it'll take 10 years. I really started to argue with him until I thought about it and realized he's probably right. It's going to probably take that much time. There is slow change going on, by the way, but it will be adopted very slowly, because this is the things that have been done with synthetics is so entrenched. So many of the great, heroes of our academic life in gynecology and endocrinology have built their careers on this synthetic stuff. You just can't back away from that overnight. So So it's not going to change overnight. Yeah, yeah, and of course, yeah, and of course, there's a phenomenal amount of money in synthetic hormones and synthetic drugs of all kinds, and natural hormones can't be patented, so they're dirt cheap. That's why when they did a study about 50 years ago, and they gave women who had terminal breast cancer estriol, and they had about more than a 40% remission rate in the breast cancer in these women who were at death's door, just by giving them estriol. They didn't say we should start giving women estriol and making sure their estriols are normal. They said we got to come up with a synthetic that works like estriol. There you go. I mean, that's the way it works. That's the way it works in medical science. And so they did. They came up with stuff like tamoxifen, relaxafen, and the Remedex, and all kinds of stuff like that. So there you go. So in terms of decisions, I hope I have helped you a little in terms of giving you some background about how to know and make and stay with or find your decision. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you guys. Thanks again.